So right in the middle of Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments, there's this short, just really a matter of pages, short passage called The Paradox and the Offended Consciousness, and he calls this an appendix. It's kind of a funny place to have an appendix. Usually they're at the end of a work. This one's right smack dab in the middle. And a little bit later on, after another chapter, he'll have an interlude where he says, we're putting something in between chapters 4 and 5. So Kierkegaard is playing around with this. He's having this be the appendix to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, as we saw in the third video in this sequence, there's this entire development on the part of reason, which is trying to come to know. When we talk about reason, we mean the rational human being. The rational human being is trying to come to know the universe, to know themselves, to know their relations with other people, to understand, what transcends them, where they fit into the scheme of things. And the reason runs into something that's absolutely different from itself. And Kierkegaard calls this the unknown. He calls this God. He calls this, later on, towards the end, the paradox. And it's something that like he says, reason desires to not only understand itself, but it desires its own downfall. Reason has a passion that it's motivated by. And its passion is to get beyond itself. So what can reason do with that, or what can the rational human being with that? They can only do that by finding something that's larger than themselves, something that can't be assimilated and broken down and put into its boxes and classified and then mastered by reason, and that is the unthinkable. And that ends up being God, or the paradox. So the fundamental question is reason going to grow, or is reason going to just sort of admit defeat, or is reason going to spin itself off into all sorts of things that look like reason but aren't really that rational? So that's what's going on as sort of the prelude to this. And he calls this an acoustic illusion. What is an acoustic illusion? Well, think about throwing your voice. With this I can't really do it because you hear me talking at you, and I don't have one of those fancy cameras that would, split things into different channels or anything like that. But, we're listening to the TV sometimes, and we'll hear something and it's in surround sound, and the surround sound on these TVs is so good these days that, the TV is right here, and it sounds like whatever it is coming from over there, and so I'm thinking, hey, there's somebody coming up the steps, or what is that sound that I'm hearing over in that direction that seems to be a little distracting? Turns out that's part of the program. Ventriloquists throwing their voice, that's an acoustic illusion. You can have certain types of architecture where if you stand in the right place, you can hear, just as if they're standing next to you, something that somebody else is saying way over on the other side of the room. There's some buildings that are designed with that sort of thing in mind. So there's an acoustic illusion going on here, and we're going to spell out precisely what that is. But first, he says, there's two possibilities for the paradox and reason. If the paradox and the reason come together in a mutual understanding, so the question is of understanding, in a mutual understanding of their unlikeness, something in which they respect their difference from each other. So the paradox understands reason, reason understands the paradox, they both understand themselves, and they understand their relationship, and they grasp their fundamental difference from each other. Not a problem for the paradox, because remember, the paradox is, after all, God. It could be a problem for reason. Rational human beings, particularly the more their reason is developed, sometimes become, almost obstinate or stupid in the process, and they're so bright and they're so good at spinning out all these webs of deductions and inferences and implications, and you look at them and you're like, yeah, but you forgot this, and they're like, wow, that doesn't fit into the system, so not going to worry about that. Well, you know, if the goal of reason is just to neatly classify things or to master nature or some of these other ideas, you know, help us live together in society, well, if that's it, then okay, then reason can be content with that. But if reason is this, it has a passion, a desire built within it to know, to understand reality, to assimilate truth to itself and itself to truth, then reason is inevitably going to collide with some things that you know, pose it with you know, something like a foreign body within its own substance that it has to figure out, what am I going to do with this? And that's what we're talking about here in terms of mutual understanding. You can understand the difference between you and something else. You can respect that difference without having to try to automatically overcome it, to break it down, to denigrate it, to in the process misunderstand it. And Kierkegaard is going to talk about some people who actually did have that before. And he says, if they come together in a mutual understanding of their unlikeness, their encounter will be happy, like love's understanding, happy in the passion to which we have not yet assigned a name. So it's not just the passion that is driving reason to its own downfall that we're concerned with. There's also another passion that Kierkegaard is going to talk about in this book, and I'll sort of give this away for you. That passion is faith. But we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. So if they, reason and the paradox, come together in a good understanding of their unlikeness to each other, then they exist in this happy passion called faith. If the encounter is not an understanding, the relationship becomes unhappy, and this unhappy love of the reason, if I may so call it, and he says, which it should be noted as analogous only to that particular form of unhappy love which has its root in misunderstood self-love, no further stretching of the analogy is possible, may be characterized more specifically as offense. So, when reason and the paradox do not come together in mutual understanding of their differences, which is not a problem, you know, on the paradox's side. The paradox is perfectly willing to do that. It's a question of whether reason, the rational human being, or, I mean, you could even think about this more broadly, you know, you can think about this, although Kierkegaard doesn't say this, in terms of a group, an organization, a society, a movement of thought. If reason doesn't come together in mutual understanding, then it is going to end up becoming the offended consciousness, as he says. It's going to take offense. And that's what this chapter is about. So he says, all offense, what can we say about it, is in its deepest root passive. In this respect, it is like that form of unhappy love to which we've just alluded. Even when such a self-love announces itself in deeds of audacious daring and astounding achievements, it is passive and wounded. It's not entirely whole. As a matter of fact, if you're thinking about this in epistemological terms, in terms of knowledge, in terms of understanding, in terms of thinking, reason is, in taking offense, in being offended, it is expressing a wound within itself that we don't normally think about. We normally think about rationality as something that's, you know, pure, higher than everything else, unassailable. It, you know, it as opposed to the emotions is, you know, not damaged. But Kierkegaard is getting at something. None of us are fully rational. We're not even sure, you know, a lot of the times when we stress just how much we're, you know, separating reason from the passions or the emotions or stuff like that, you know, we can't be completely sure that we're actually doing that there isn't, you know, some sort of passion driving the reason in that case, making it as you know, the human perspective, a slave of the passion. We make all sorts of crazy deductions and inferences on the basis of insufficient evidence, taking positions that we don't really have a full right to take, being obstinate when we're presented with any sort of evidence that might change us in our mind to the contrary, not being willing to make the effort to understand positions that seem opposed to our own, to see whether they in fact are even opposed or whether the problem is on our side. So, reason is in fact finding itself to be wounded. And like he says, it's the pain of this wound that gives it this illusory strength, expressing itself in what looks like self-activity. Now, offense, like Kierkegaard says, is an act on the part of reason. It is an act on the part of the rational human being in relation to the paradox, in relation to God. So there is an active side to it, but it's fundamentally passive in that it's not really calling the shots, it's not determining the parameters of the possibilities here. And it takes its stand on the basis of sort of, one or two things. Either I'm going to choose this, and you're not going to make me choose something else, because I'm going to choose it, so will. Or I can't possibly see things otherwise. Necessity compels me to see things this way. So, something that presents itself as if it's reason, but a reason, you might say, in chains. And both of these are sort of secretly tied in with each other. Anyway, let's go on with this. He says, even when it tramples on the object of affection, even when it painfully schools itself into a hardened indifference and tortures itself to show this indifference, even then, even when it abandons itself to a frivolous triumph over its success, he's talking about unhappy love, even then it's passive. Such is also the case with the offended consciousness. Whatever be its mode of expression, even when it exultantly celebrates the triumph of its unspirituality, it is always passive. Whether the offended individual sits broken-hearted, staring almost like a beggar at the paradox, saying, I can't possibly make sense of this, this is not something comprehensible, so that would be, standing like the beggar, paralyzed by his suffering, or he sheathes himself in the armor of his derision. Look at those stupid religious people believing in all sorts of nonsense, what, they think that God, changes his mind in history, or God would, need to come and redeem us, or, pick the sort of things that people make fun of religious people for saying and believing. That's sheathing oneself in the armor of derision, as Kierkegaard says. And it's interesting, because you think about it as like going on the attack. I'm going to demolish those pretensions that the religious people or their God would have. But really what it's doing is sort of setting up an armor for oneself. I don't want to let that get into me, so I'm not going to do it. I'm going to just, push it away. He's still passive in this case. Whether offense came and robbed the offended individual of his last bit of comfort and joy or made him strong, the offended consciousness is nevertheless passive. It has wrestled with the stronger, and its show of strength is like the peculiar agility induced in the bodily sphere by a broken back. Beautiful metaphor of a very ugly idea. Reason has a capacity to deform itself, to make itself lesser than it ought to be in relation to things that transcend it, so that it can keep itself to itself and just hold on to what it has. That's what he's talking about there. And he says we can distinguish between an active and a passive form of the offended consciousness if we take care to remember two things. One is, the passive form is so far active as to not permit itself wholly to be annihilated, for offense, like he says, is always an act. So the person who is totally passive with this is not allowing themselves to be sort of effaced by this. They're still there and they're still choosing. The active form is always so weak it cannot free itself from the cross to which it is nailed or tear the arrow out from its wound. So, when it is active, when it's pushing away the paradox, it's still in some respect tormented by it. And I have to say, on a personal note, I am reminded in this of the vast difference that I have myself experienced in talking with a lot of people involved in, the study of religions, in religious life, in spirituality. I find that apologeticists on both sides, for religion and against religion, tend not to be particularly happy people. And by apologeticists, I mean those who think that they're going to find knockdown, drag-down arguments that are going to convince everybody, and they throw them in your face, and they're like, see, look at this. And some religious people do that, and some anti-religious people do that. I don't even say like non-religious people, because those people go beyond and they become anti-religious, and it's like, their own particular passion becomes showing everybody how wrong they are. Well, that's what he's talking about here by offense. And that's a particularly active form of it, but it still can't tear itself away. And so you watch those people and you're like, man, if you don't believe in God, that's one thing. But you certainly spend, for a God you don't believe in, you spend an awful lot of time thinking about how much you dislike him, and you're sort of expending your energies on something that you say is nothing. Well, Kierkegaard would say that makes perfect sense. There you have a rational person whose reason exists in an unhappy lack of understanding in relation to the paradox, has a passion that's still nevertheless driving them towards it, and is unhappy in that passion. So, let's go on from this. So he says, this is another really important point. Because offense is passive, the discovery, if it be allowable to speak thus, does not derive from the reason, but the paradox. And here we're getting to this notion of the acoustic illusion. This is a really important point, and I want to take the time to sort of separate this out from another point. So he's saying that the discovery of the paradox and offense is not coming from the side of reason, although reason thinks that it is. It's actually coming from the paradox. He's also going to say very soon that it's not just the discovery of it, the very fact of it, like he says, the understanding of it, the existence of offense is coming from the paradox as well. So that's something pretty important. If reason is really like functioning on all of its capacities, if it's running on all cylinders, as we say, then it wouldn't actually stay in offense, not for long. And it would realize that its offense is actually sort of a reaction on its part from what is coming to it from the paradox. But reason is not, that well put together, that integrated. And so, even to fully understand what's going on with offense, that has to come from the paradox. Why this is an acoustic illusion, and Kierkegaard is talking in terms of voices, is because reason thinks that it's hearing its own voice saying what's actually coming from the paradox. So the paradox is providing the knowledge, the understanding, even the terms of the problem. Reason is not able to hear that coming from the paradox, and has to sort of think, this is coming from me. So it's like somebody, and people like this. Some people take credit for everybody else's ideas, and a lot of times those people, sometimes they're very just, deceptive and opportunistic, and they say, yeah, I like that person's idea, I'm going to take it, and they know that it's coming from the other person, and they don't convince themselves that they came up with it themselves, and so they're going to stay away from that person because they know, hey, I screwed them over. There's a lot of other cases where you're talking with somebody and you've got a good idea and you mention it, and they're like, yeah, that's a great idea. And then later on you hear them talking about it, and they're talking about it as if it is their own idea, and they're convinced. And they convince other people because of this. This is one of the problems in dealing with people who are particularly bad off when it comes to the self-deception. They can actually be convincing because they think that they came up with that idea themselves, that it's their own brainchild or something like that. Well, that's what's going on here with the paradox and the offended consciousness. So he says the paradox itself, and he's got this very nice phrase that's coming to us from ancient philosophy. It's a Latin phrase, but it's actually coming from an idea that's older in Greek philosophy. There are some things that are supposed to be index sui et falsi. So the truth is the index, or the judge or indication, or however you want to put it, of itself and of the false. So truth has a certain priority over falsehood. Likewise, at least in traditional Christian thought, good has a priority over evil, so that evil is really a privation or a corruption or something missing or something going wrong with the good. Good has a priority over evil. It's not that they're just simply opposites. Same thing with truth and falsity. Well, it's the same thing with the paradox. He says the paradox is index et judex sui and falsi. The index and the judge of itself and of what is false. What is false, at least insofar as it's not really getting things right, is reason. It's certainly not getting it right that it thinks that it's coming up with all this on its own. It's also not getting things right in that it's saying, yeah, I don't think that this stuff actually exists, or if it does, it's a terrible, terrible thing. It's absurd. It's irrational. I can't possibly be in a good relationship with it. So like he says, offense is the mistaken reckoning, the invalid consequence with which the paradox repels and thrusts aside. The offended individual does not speak from his own resources, but borrows those of the paradox. Just as one who mimics or parodies another does not invent, but merely copies perversely. Beautiful way to put it. Let me go back over that one more time. He says, offense is the mistaken reckoning, the invalid consequence. And what does he mean there? What he means is that reason is getting things wrong in its own activity. Mistaken reckoning, the invalid consequence, with which the paradox repels and thrusts aside. The offended individual does not speak from his own resources. Again, reason thinks, the offended individual thinks that they're on their own, that God or the divinity or whatever you want to say, the transcendent, sort of is just out there by itself and not connected to it, and it's going to speak from its own resources about it. It's going to use its own reasoning to figure out whether it could be or could not be, and it borrows those resources from the paradox. So this is kind of interesting, because if you think about this, and I'm going to come back to the rest of this statement in a moment, we're looking at arguments for the existence of God in chapter 3, and Kierkegaard said, most of the time they're not actually doing what they're supposed to do. Kierkegaard is not a big proponent of arguments for God's existence. He says you can't actually go from ideas or attributes to existence, you have to go from something that actually exists and then start talking about whether it has these attributes or is this kind of thing. And he criticized what we would see as the traditional theistic proofs of God's existence. Kierkegaard would also be just as big of a critic, at least of this Kierkegaard, of arguments for the non-existence of God of the sort of traditional types. For instance, the argument from evil. This is a big argument that is given to try to claim that God can't possibly exist, and that's certainly not a good God, not the God of traditional Christianity, Judaism, Islam, not a God who would be all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, and yet have evil in the world. Well, Kierkegaard would say, when you're doing that, when you're reasoning like that, you think that you're only using your own resources, and now you've sort of disproven the existence of this thing out there. But really, where did you get all these ideas from in the first place? From that very thing whose existence you are now trying to disprove. And I think he would say that about many of the other arguments against God's existence that you can find philosophers making. Whether they're just reductive things, God can't possibly exist because we know that God is just a projection of our imagination, our fantasy of father figures, from our infantile dream or fantasy life, a la Freud. God can't possibly exist because he's just a projection of society writ large or something like that, sociological explanation. Any of these sort of things, reason thinks that it has the upper hand and it's like, going to judge this. Really, though, the trouble is that the arguments against God's existence don't work any better, according to Kierkegaard, than the arguments for God's existence. In part because reason isn't as capable as you think it is, and in part because reason is deriving its powers from the paradox. Now, it goes a little bit further. This is where, again, this phrase is very important. It borrows those of the paradox just as one who mimics or parodies another does not invent but merely copies perversely. So, why is he using that language there? Reason is not fully rational. Human reason, at least. When it takes the resources from the paradox, in straightening them out, it somehow makes them in other ways more crooked. In restoring what it thinks to be proper measure to them, it distorts the measure that would actually allow it to make the right kind of measurements and inferences. We could go on with these sort of metaphors. It's mimicking the paradox, it's parodying it, it's taking resources from it, but then sort of, garbling them up. And so he says, the more profound the passion with which the offended consciousness expresses itself. The offended consciousness is expressive. Screw God, he's absurd. I'm not going to have anything to do with any sort of conception like that. A God who could allow infants to suffer is a terrible God with whom I want to have nothing to do. All these sorts of things. Or I haven't been convinced. You can't possibly convince me because I know from my own experience that all there is what we see here. You pick any sort of expression of the offended consciousness that you like, even more subtle ones like, well, okay, there is a God, but he's a screw-up because he allowed the devil and Adam and Eve to sin, and then they somehow screwed it up for everybody else, and that doesn't make any sense. That's an expression, again, of the offended consciousness, and its reason sort of spinning its wheels and spitting its venom at this object. Now, like he says, offense was not discovered by the reason. Far from it. Because then reason would have been able to discover the paradox. But reason doesn't discover the paradox. Instead, what happens is reason is out there kind of groping, and the paradox, whack, runs right into it and says, here I am. And that's a really good way to put it, because the paradox is not just, some sort of object that reason is groping around and then finally reaches, and now it's trying to find it. It's a personal experience, right? The paradox itself is, in some ways, like a hyper reason. It's dynamic. It's responsive. So, like he says, no offense comes into existence with the paradox. It comes, and here he reaffirms this, it comes into existence. And now I think that that's a passage that's well worth reflecting on if we're thinking in terms of existential philosophy. Kierkegaard had said, we're looking at earlier stuff, that you're not going to prove God's existence. You start from something being out there and then try to figure out what the hell it is and what our relationship is to it, and have we screwed up our understanding of it, and see what it actually has to say, those sorts of things. But now he's going a little bit further, and he's saying that offense comes into existence. But the offense is not something totally distinguishable from the reason, from the human being. He's talking about original sin here without actually using the term original sin. He's giving a philosophical interpretation to a theological, religious concept, or maybe even experience, or if you like, dogma. The offense comes into existence along with us. We don't create the offense, except insofar as we muddy it up even more. Imagine that there's water before you, and it's already a bit murky, and in order to try to make it less murky, you try to move the silt away, and now you actually just stir up the bottom even more. Or there's a house of cards, and it's slightly leaning, and so you say, I'm gonna fix this, and now all of a sudden they start coming down, and you're trying to rearrange them, and it's getting even worse and worse and worse. Or imagine, here's a culinary metaphor. The soup that you're making isn't quite right. There's something missing to it. So you add an ingredient. Now there's too much of that. You say, how can I counterbalance this? So it's sweet. I'll pour in something sour, and now there's too much of that in there. And I'll add something bitter to counterbalance that. And pretty soon it just tastes like some sort of mishmash of all sorts of things. Well, that in a way. These are all metaphors that we can use to understand how we make the offense worse. But he says it comes into existence. Here again, we have the moment. This critical idea that Kierkegaard has been stressing over and over again. The moment. Time matters. Personal histories matter. If all we had was the sort of Socratic philosophical understanding, then the moment doesn't matter, and the moment is just absurdity and folly, as he says. But if we have the capacity, or if the universe or God or whatever we want to call it, has the capacity to sort of rupture into time, to make some moments more decisive, more critical, more important, more determinative, not only of what comes after, but also what came before. If that's the case, then we have to take that very seriously. So he says, if we posit the moment, the paradox is there. For the moment is the paradox in its most abbreviated form. Because of the moment, the learner is in error, and man who before possessed self-knowledge now becomes bewildered with respect to himself. Instead of self-knowledge, he receives the consciousness of sin, and so forth. From the psychological point of view, he says, the offended consciousness will display a great variety of nuances within the more active and more passive forms. And he says, I'm not going to try to explore those. And you know, if you look at Kierkegaard's other works, in essence what he's doing is he's exploring many different forms of this. But, like he says, all offense is a misunderstanding of the moment, since it is directed against the paradox, which again is the moment. So, by taking offense, the rational person is, you might say, imposing categories onto the paradox, not that the paradox can't accept or admit, but which are just not going to be applicable to it in such a way as to yield for reason what it is that reason really is desiring, what it has passion for, something greater than itself to be put into relationship with that. In a way, reason is like the clumsy lover who keeps, again, making things worse. You know, first they take offense, and they're clumsy, and somehow, you know, screw things up with the beloved, and the beloved is like, well, you know, not the brightest guy, but I still love him. I'll still be in a relationship with him. But he feels so guilty about it that now he's like self-conscious, and he's trying to make things better, and each gesture that he makes, because it's ill-conceived, makes things worse. That's the way that reason is like when it's in a bad relationship with the paradox. So, like he says, the reaction of the offended consciousness is to assert that the moment is folly and that the paradox is folly. So here we get to another key term, the absurd. Reason says to the paradox, says to the moment, this is absurd. How can there possibly be anything important, as a French intellectual said to, a French student said to Maurice Blondel when he was studying at the École Normale. This is a French student who was sort of, you know, disparaging Christianity. How can something that happened in some backwater village of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago have anything to do with me, let alone with philosophy, let alone with the world today, let alone with reality as a whole? And Blondel said that was sort of perfectly representative of the attitude of his time during the French Third Republic. And that would be sort of a rejection of the moment. You could also say this about more personal moments. You know, a person suddenly realizes, or perhaps gradually realizes, wow, I've been radically wrong when it came to understanding matters of spirituality and religion. What the hell am I going to do now? I'd better figure out how to get myself back on track. But I have no idea how to get myself back on track. I just know that I don't like where I am now, and I'm kind of ashamed of how things have gone, and there's less and less time available to me to figure out, you know, the big questions in life. And as it turned out, the way in which I was going about trying to figure them out was actually screwing me up even more and making me less able to hear the answers that are out there. And, you know, they start spinning their wheels, and then something happens. And they say, oh yeah, God did this. I felt a sense of peace. I knew that I had to start looking at things this way, and that didn't come from me. Well, you know, from the perspective of the offended consciousness, you look at that sort of stuff and you're like, wow, you're a religious nut. Yeah, okay, you may think that God came in and did something in your being and changed you in some sort of way, but that's got nothing to do with me, Jack, nor should it have anything to do with anybody else. That's absurd. The very, you know, paradox itself is, from reason's point of view, absurd. And so he says, The offended consciousness holds aloof from the paradox, and the reason is quia absurdum, because it is absurd. But it was not the reason that made this discovery. On the contrary, it was the paradox that made this discovery, and now receives the testimony from the offended consciousness. Again, the acoustic illusion. Reason thinks that it's saying this for the first time, and then the paradox says in return, I've been saying this to you all along. Finally, you heard me. Great. You still kind of got it wrong, but at least now you finally heard some of what I was saying to you. And so the reason says the paradox is absurd, but this is mere mimicry, because the paradox is the paradox because it is absurd. The offended consciousness holds aloof from the paradox and keeps to the probable, since the paradox is the most improbable of things. But again, it's not reason that made this discovery. It merely snatches the words, Kierkegaard says, from the mouth of the paradox, strange as this may seem. For the paradox itself says, and now notice again, the paradox is being framed in a very personal way so that it has, you might say, equal rights of personality with reason. It's there. The relationship that reason would have with it is not of a subject with an object, but of a subject with another subject. So the paradox says, comedies and romances and lies must needs probable, but why should I be probable? The offended consciousness holds aloof from the paradox, and what wonder, since the paradox is the miracle. Again, this discovery was not made by the reason, since it was the paradox that placed the reason on the stool of wonderment, and now replies, why are you so astonished? It's precisely as you say. The only wonder is that you regard it as an objection. When the reason boasts of its splendors in comparison with the paradox, which is most wretched and despised, that also came from the paradox. And now, a lot of this makes more sense if you actually frame it, as I think that you have to do, in terms of actual, scriptural texts. So Kierkegaard has in mind, again, what he's doing here is he's giving you a philosophical interpretation of religious doctrines, of theological conceptions that are coming from the paradox having revealed itself for him in the person of Jesus Christ. And where would we get our conception of this? From these religious texts which we call the Gospels. And if you actually read the Gospels, this is sort of a digression, but I think this is actually really good to keep in mind at this point. Again, let me stress this. Kierkegaard is giving a philosophical interpretation of religious doctrine. And so if that religious doctrine is coming from the Gospels, if you read these things, they're bewildering. There's no one single consistent message. And anybody who tells you that the Gospels are all just about this phrase or this idea, no, they're paradoxical. You read through them and you're like, wow, that's a hard saying. There's actually like a whole genre of things that are called hard sayings that come up in the Gospels. Chesterton, after Kierkegaard, of course, points out that those who, like to compare the historical Jesus, who probably was this really mild, meek guy, with the Jesus of the church, who's this mean, repellent person who's all about rules and thou shalt nots and stuff like that. He says, man, they've never actually read the Gospels, have they? Because if you actually read the Gospels, you'll see that in a lot of cases, what you're getting from religious authorities is kind of watered down, milksop kind of stuff. That if you actually read these texts, this guy is, like he says, speaking with authority and saying things that people were just bewildered by and like, whoa, what the hell are you saying here? Well, that would be what Kierkegaard is calling the paradox. So again, I'm going to say this phrase one more time and then hopefully I won't bring it up again. Philosophical interpretation of a theological idea. And now notice, the philosophical interpretation would be on this side, right? Because what is philosophy's main tool? reason. The theological truth is coming from here towards reason. Reason is interpreting it. Okay, so back to this, because there's still a little bit more that we have to say, and this is actually turning out to be a much longer video than I expected. He has a couple little digs here about philosophers that are really good. And he says, when reason takes pity on the paradox and wishes to help it to an explanation. Now this is what happens when German idealist philosophy approaches religion, or other different rationalistic views of philosophy are sort of superimposed not just on religion as a social thing, but on the objects of religion. The philosopher is going to make God speak more clearly, would be a way to put it. He says, when reason takes pity on the paradox and wishes to help it to an explanation, the paradox does not indeed acquiesce, but nevertheless finds it quite natural that reason should do this. For why do we have our philosophers, if not to make supernatural things trivial and commonplace? When the reason says it cannot get the paradox into its head, when the reason takes offense and says, that doesn't make sense, the paradox says, it was not the reason that made the discovery, but the paradox, which is so paradoxical as to declare the reason a blockhead and a dunce, capable at the most of saying yes and no to the same thing, which is not good divinity. And so always. Kierkegaard is saying, this is something, this is a dynamic which you're going to see over and over and over again running throughout the history of religion, the attempts of the human being to place itself in relation to the paradox, that is, to God, to the divine, that which transcends it, that which has given it this very problematic, that which gives it, in some respect, what it needs to get past its offense that it's taking. When the human being says, I know better than God how God should talk and the way God should be, that's setting things up, according to Kierkegaard, for, the paradox to just say, wow, you really managed to get that wrong. Now, after this, in this section here, Kierkegaard has another one of these passages where he has the writer being accused of plagiarism, and this is a particularly important one. He's done this now 3 times. He says, I hear someone say it's really becoming tiresome the way you go on, for now we have the same story over again. Not one of the expressions you've put into the mouth of the paradox belongs to you. And Kierkegaard says, yeah, that makes perfect sense. You know why? Because I'm over here. The paradox would have given me this just as much as it would have given, reason in the abstract that. So he says, why should they belong to me when they belong to the paradox? Now his interlocutor says back to him, you can spare us your sophistry. You know very well what I mean. These expressions are not yours, nor by you put into the mouth of the paradox, but are familiar quotations, and everybody knows who their authors are. So this imaginary critic is saying, you're not plagiarizing from the paradox, you're plagiarizing from other human beings who have said these kind of things themselves. So, this is a really important point. A lot of people will say Kierkegaard is all about the lone individual, no sense of community, no sense of tradition, continuity. Here's a place where Kierkegaard is actually stressing something like a community of inquiry, a tradition of placing oneself in relation to the paradox. So he says, my friend, your accusation does not grieve me, but what you say makes me exceedingly glad. For I must admit I could not repress a shudder when I wrote them down. I scarcely recognized myself, that I, who am usually so timid and apprehensive, dared to say such things. But if the expressions are not by me, perhaps you'll say who they belong to. Now that is great. It actually makes me glad to read that and to say it to you. I've said this in my classes, and I say this in some of my videos. One of the best parts about teaching philosophy is I don't have to make this stuff up. It's already there. Somebody else has already said it. I just have to, do my part in bringing it to contemporary life. But I don't invent what Plato said. Plato said what Plato said, and Plato figured that out on his own 23 and some odd change 100 years ago. And I get to actually follow in those footsteps. And I have to admit that I myself am one of these kind of people who would be, timid and apprehensive to say such things. I mean, I'm going to say that there's a paradox there that reason has a passion for, that automatically, or necessarily leads it into collision with this paradox, and that, reason takes offense at it. You think I would have come up with that on my own? I wouldn't. And Kierkegaard says he didn't either. I'm often struck when I'm reading through great philosophers at I'm struck by what they say, and I'm pleased that it's as if a whole range has been set out in front of me, things that I never would have gotten around to thinking myself, wouldn't have had the capacity to come up with on my own. And I'm like, wow, so somebody could actually think that. That's great. The same thing when I read great literature, histories, the wisdom literature of the world, religious texts. The breadth and the richness and the depth of what's available is kind of shocking. So anyway, Kierkegaard says, okay, so I didn't say these things. Who said them? Who am I plagiarizing from? And the critic says, nothing is easier. The first is by Tertullian, the second by Hamann, the third by Hamann, the fourth is by Lactantius and frequently quoted, the fifth is by Shakespeare in a comedy called All's Well That Ends Well, and he actually quotes scene and act. The sixth is by Luther, and the seventh is a remark by King Lear. Well, these are not bad people to be in company with. Tertullian, one of the great thinkers of the early church. True, there were some things a bit off about the guy, but you can say the same thing about most of the church fathers if you dig deep enough. Look at Jerome. He was kind of a cantankerous guy, but he translated the Bible into Latin, into the Vulgate, and wrote some great letters. So Tertullian said that stuff. Wow, that's great. Lactantius, another one of the great church fathers, a Christian philosopher who wrote a defense of the Christian philosophy. Hamann, a fairly obscure these days German philosopher who was sort of opposed to what was going on in German idealism. Shakespeare. There's a lot of great thinking that I wouldn't hesitate to call philosophy embedded in Shakespeare's plays. Martin Luther. Martin Luther was not a dummy. He didn't get to be the sort of head of a movement by just coming up with one idea and just sticking with that. Some of his followers are kind of along those lines, but if you actually read Luther, you may not agree with him. I myself don't agree with him on a lot of stuff, including his choice of language sometimes. But you have to admire the brilliance with which he actually works. So he says, you see I'm well informed and that I've caught you with the goods. This is imaginary interlocutor. And Kierkegaard says, yes, I perceive it, but now will you tell me whether all these men have not spoken of the relationship between some paradox and an offended consciousness? And will you now note that the individuals who spoke were not themselves offended? So you remember going back to the question of the understanding. At the very beginning of this entire section, the paradox and the offended consciousness, we said, If the paradox and the reason come together in a mutual understanding of their unlikeness, the encounter will be happy, like love's understanding, happy in the passion to which we have not yet assigned a name. And now we can assign that name. Now we can actually put some of this stuff in. So I'm going to clear some of this ground a little bit. The happy understanding, the name for that passion is faith. And there are other people who have been in this relationship of faith with the paradox, with God. For Kierkegaard, faith is not simply a set of propositions that you have. It's not turning your brain off and saying, okay, don't think anymore, just feel, just accept these things that you don't understand. Faith is the work by the rational human being through this passion, through this drive to make sense of the paradox, which gives itself to reason, which gives reason resources to make sense of it, which reveals its very condition to reason so that reason doesn't have to stumble around in the dark by itself trying to reconstruct the entire universe, the human condition, and God all on its own, out of its own, ideas or experiences. So Kierkegaard says, the individuals who spoke thus were not themselves offended, but precisely persons who held to the paradox, and yet they speak as if they were offended. That's why they're so hard to understand sometimes. An offense cannot find a more characteristic expression for itself. Is it not strange that the paradox should thus, as it were, take the bread from the mouth of the offended consciousness, reducing it to the practice of an idle and unprofitable art? And he says, one merit unquestionably belongs to the offended consciousness in that it brings out the unlikeness between reason and the paradox more clearly. For in that happy passion which we have not yet given a name, the unlike is on good terms with the reason. There must be a difference if there is to be a synthesis in some third entity. But here the difference consisted in the fact, this is where we're going to leave off. This is very important. The difference consisted in the fact that the reason yielded itself, while the paradox bestowed itself. And the understanding is consummated in that happy passion which will doubtless soon find a name. And this is the smallest part of the matter, finding a name. For even if my happiness does not have a name, when I'm happy I ask for no more. So, reason, like you said, yielded itself. Does that mean that reason disappeared? That, what we're talking about here is a total lapse into irrationality? No. Oops. There we go. Reason yielded itself. That is an act. That is a choice on the part of the rational human being. Also a response to a person on the other side. A person who gives itself to reason. A person who gives reason even an understanding of what it is to be over here. And the relationship is taking place between them. This is a very beautiful metaphysical passage. And that's where we're going to leave off. And spent a lot of time, a lot more than I intended to, talking about this very short passage, but like we found out, there's an awful lot there. And now we can plow ahead through the rest of philosophical fragments.